There's no coal left in the hills around my hometown. Even before the mountaintops were cleared, even before the trees withered and the water in the streams ran gray, we knew that the end was coming. Anybody who could left town in search of a better life somewhere else. But there were plenty more of us who couldn't. I was one of them. If you watch the news, you might have heard about some of the darker activities that folks out here turned to after the mines closed down. Pills, meth, other worse things that the media never got wind of. Like how Randy Clevewell and his brothers would park their pickup on the side of the highway and pretend to have broken down. Then, when somebody stopped, well, you get the idea. They stripped the vehicles for parts, then buried the bodies so deep in the woods they wouldn't be found till Judgment Day. More than once, Randy invited me to ride along, but I wasn't that desperate. Not back then, anyway. The pension that Ma received each month wasn't great, but between that, our garden, and a few deer each season, we managed to get by without hurting anybody else. One morning in November, I woke up to find the house cold. Ma usually turned on the heater before she made breakfast for the two of us, and I remember lying beneath all those blankets and praying that the propane hadn't run out early. If it had, we couldn't afford to replace it until next month. I knew that Ma was dead even before I pulled open the curtains of her bedroom. I'd like to believe that the overdose was accidental, but a letter I found on her nightstand makes me think otherwise. It was from the mining company that Pa had worked for, announcing its own insolvency. Ma was too old and unhealthy to work, so I knew what the news meant for her. The end of her ability to feed herself and her family. The end of everything. Almost everyone in town showed up to Ma's funeral, and still, the church looked empty. The Clevewell brothers gave me a nod from across the aisle. I looked at my polished black shoes and wondered if I was ready to take them up on their offer. There didn't seem to be much choice. Then, on the drive back through town, I saw something strange behind the closed-down diner. Now hiring. Those words hadn't been seen in these parts for a decade, if not longer. And yet, there they were. Blood red against the white walls of a pop-up tent. I parked along the deserted curb and walked up to it before I even knew what I was doing. Two people sat behind a plastic table within. A man and a woman. 20-somethings, both dressed in matching blue vests. They were clean-cut, stylish, and smelled like the city. The boy introduced himself as Jude. The girl, Aisha. They shook my hand and asked how my day was going. I looked down at my funeral suit and thought better of telling them the truth. They wanted to know if I was looking for work. I told them that I was. They were all smiles as they indicated the folios beside them and suggested I fill out the application inside. The longer the pair talked, the more uneasy I began to feel. The whole interaction felt scripted, and although their brochure was full of flowery language and sleek photographs, by the time I got to the end of it, I still had no idea of what kind of work Jude and Aisha were offering. I had never heard of the company, Arcova Industries, and the pay they were offering wasn't much to brag about. Still, it was better than any other legal work those of us who were stuck here were likely to get. As I slipped the form into the box beside Jude and Aisha, I had the strangest feeling that I had already gotten the job. And, as it turned out, my instincts were right. I got the call 2 days later while I was plucking the weeds from Ma's garden, and wishing I'd paid more attention to how she'd made it grow. I wasn't surprised to hear Aisha's voice on the other end of the line, telling me that my application had been accepted. I could come in Monday to sign the paperwork and begin my orientation. I did a double take when I heard the address I was supposed to report to. It was the portal of the old mine. Portal. It was the word the industry used to designate the critical point of access to a mine system, the only way in or out of an underground world. Back when Pa was still alive and working down there, that was exactly how I imagined it. A glowing electrostatic field straight out of one of the cheesy sci-fi movies we got on the Dish networks. It was only later, after the mine shut down and all of us kids started hanging around the fenced-off ruins, that I understood the portal was much more like a great black mouth in the mountainside. When I pulled up that cloudy Monday morning, lights were on in the offices the mining company had abandoned. I recognized a lot of the vehicles out front, too. Arcova Industries had built a series of large structures, almost like a warehouse, linking the offices to the portal. From the parking area, it looked like a cancerous white growth on the side of the mountain. There were so many familiar faces in the bare white room Aisha led me into that it seemed like a town meeting. Young and old, male and female, black or white, it didn't matter. Everyone had come in search of something we hadn't seen out there for a long time. A little bit of hope. It was Jude who gave the presentation, a fact which led me to question whether Arcova Industries had any employees apart from that pair of grinning city slickers. The gist of it was simple. Some of us would be going into the mine to drill deeper, while others would be transporting the broken stone or scanning it as it exited the pit. Scanning for what? I wondered. There was nothing of value down there anymore. Everybody knew that. Still, a job was a job, and we were all happy to milk it while it lasted. The mine had closed down before I was old enough to go underground, but some of the older guys, like Clive and Owen, had experience with heavy equipment. They would be the ones drilling and moving the rock. The rest of us, like me, would be sorting or scanning on the line. By the end of the first hour of training, I was already bored to tears. There was nothing special about the lumps of ugly, charcoal gray rock that came down the conveyor belt. Or at least, nothing that set off the mundane scanners in our hands. They reminded me of the ones used in the supermarket, only heavier, as though their electronic guts were more complicated than that. I wondered queasily if we were testing for radiation or some kind of deadly pollutant. And if so, why weren't we wearing any safety equipment apart from gloves, goggles, hard hats, and those ridiculous blue vests? After our first day, a lot of us went over to Sloan's for a drink. It was the only bar nearby that had survived the mine shutdown, and that was only because it was near the highway, and the owner turned a blind eye to the trafficking, of all kinds, that went on in his parking lot. Even old Billy Sloan himself seemed to be in a good mood that night. And why not? We were all buying rounds like there was no tomorrow. Maybe the whole thing was a sign that the luck of this forgotten little town was finally starting to turn. And we spent all night speculating about who our new employers were and what they wanted. The theories got wilder the more we drank. But by closing time, we were no closer to an answer than we'd been when we walked in the door. 3 months passed that way. Good months, for the most part. Folks in town had money again, and it was honest money, no matter how odd or soul-crushing the work seemed to be. Most of us just spaced out until our shift was over, drank until we felt good about it, then did it all over again the next day. Jude and Aisha were the only ones who seemed excited about the whole thing, passionate even, like they were waiting for something to happen. Then, on a sunny afternoon in February, it finally did. Connie, up at the head of the line, was passing her scanner over more of the same gray rocks. Without warning, the device beeped. It was so faint and sudden that we weren't sure we'd heard it at first. But Jude came running. He collected the plastic box of shattered stone and took it away without another word. The line stopped running and we were all sent home for the day. The next morning, everything seemed like business as usual. Except Clive didn't show up for work. Connie, who'd had her nose in other people's business for as long as I could remember, asked Aisha about his absence. The hip young administrator brushed off her concerns. Although she couldn't go into detail for legal reasons, She was confident that Clive was just fine. And maybe he was. But no one in town ever saw him again. I wasn't as bothered by Clive's disappearance as some of the others were. The guy had always been a flake, and everyone knew how toxic his relationship with his ex Jennifer was. Every other day, he swore that he was going to pack his bags and leave town, and I couldn't say I blamed him. I'd had some similar thoughts myself. As the money piled up, I started to speculate about how much I'd need to start over someplace new. In a few months, I would have enough to seriously consider the idea. But, for the moment, it was back to scanning rubble. It wasn't long before Jude came to me with an awkward request. Since I was the youngest and fittest one on my crew, he wanted me to take Clive's place within the mine itself. Jude reminded me that shift rotations were included in my contract, and I saw right away what he was implying. If I refused, I could be fired on the spot. While I wasn't thrilled about going down there, in the dark beneath all those silent tons of rock, I told myself that it had to be more interesting than sitting in front of a conveyor belt for 8 hours a day. Besides, I might get a chance to ask Owen for more details about what had happened to Clive. I blazed through the company-mandated safety course, and in no time at all, I was ready to head underground with Owen. He was a burly, heavy-set guy in his 40s, who hardly ever smiled and talked even less. As we descended into the darkness, he pointed out the massive, colorful markings on the wall which pointed to the exit. "The way out is clear," Owen told me. "Most of the time." "Huh?" I scratched my head, already sweating beneath my helmet. "Just be careful, that's all," Owen shrugged. The pitch blackness of the tunnels opened endlessly ahead, and closed endlessly behind. It felt like hours passed before we reached the new excavations, which, I noticed uncomfortably, continued straight ahead and down. This wasn't a long wall setup. It wasn't even the outdated room and pillar technique that the previous company had used. It was just a hole. "Watch out for the walls. They like to bleed," Owen grumbled. "They like to what?" I shouted. I was sure I hadn't heard him right, but he was trudging even further down the new tunnel. It wasn't long before we reached its end, and an even more obvious question occurred to me. "How do we know where to dig?" I asked Owen. "Like this." I realized that the big man had a device hanging from his belt, one that wasn't so different from the scanners we used up above. He moved it slowly along the rough-cut stone until it beeped. "Here." Owen tapped the rock. "We dig here." While we split stone and transported the rubble up to the scanning crew, I thought over what Owen had said. "The way out is clear. Most of the time. Watch out for the walls. They like to bleed." I had gone to school with Owen's younger brother, and I remembered him as the sort of guy who'd tie a burning rag to a stray cat's tail for fun. He was probably just messing with me, making me sweat a little for being the new guy. We worked in silence for a few hours, and then, just before our lunch break, I noticed a thin trickle of liquid running down the wall beside me. I couldn't tell whether it was inky black or just looked that way because of how it stained the rock, but whatever it was, it didn't seem to be water. When I tapped Owen on the shoulder and pointed to it, he just rolled his eyes. "You'll get used to it," was all he said. I wish I could say that I did, but every time I saw that stuff seep out of the wall, like pus oozing from an open wound, I got a queasy feeling in the pit of my stomach. Then there were the echoes. Noises that, no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't find a logical explanation for. It almost sounded like something was crawling along the other side of the stone. Back when the mine was in full operation, crowded with workers and the racket of all that machinery, nobody would have noticed the noise. But now, things were different down here. The first time the signals on the wall changed, I didn't notice until the panic set in. I made 4 right turns, and yet somehow I still wasn't back where I'd started. Those rough-cut stone tunnels all looked the same, and how many miles of them were connected to our worksite? How long might it be before someone realized I was missing? Owen had already taken his lunch break, and for all I knew, he wouldn't even report me missing. Maybe he'd think it was funny. The more nervous I got, the faster I jogged, until I was soaked with sweat beneath my heavy gear. I was utterly, hopelessly lost. I stood still and listened to the currents of air that traversed those empty passages, to the dripping of water somewhere far away. The skittering sound seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere all at once. I spun, trying to locate it, and came face to face with a stranger at the far end of the passage. No, not a stranger. Clive. In the blinding light of his headlamp, it took me a moment to recognize him, but when I did, it was obvious that he had been dead for days. Something had eaten his eyes. Rigor mortis had locked his face into a hideous, gray grin, and yet somehow he spoke to me. A single word. Leave. I fled that awful, walking corpse as fast as I could. I nearly ran straight into Owen's beer gut as he rounded the corner. I jabbed my finger over my shoulder in terror, but when I turned, the passage was empty. From somewhere down below, a current of air blew my damp, grimy hair a little tighter against my scalp. You sneak off to take a piss or something? Owen sneered. Too good to use a bottle like the rest of us? He shook a little plastic jug full of yellow liquid. I couldn't believe it, but I was actually happy to see the guy. The mean glint in Owen's eye suggested that he knew exactly what had just happened to me. Maybe he had even gone through similar experiences, but as long as it wasn't happening to him, he clearly thought the whole thing was hilarious. I wish I could say that it ended there, but it didn't. Each week we tunneled deeper, and the further we went, the more frequent those hallucinations, if that's what they were, became. I'd hear voices calling my name, or smell Ma's unforgettable biscuits and gravy from the end of a passage that led nowhere. I'd feel something angry pull at the roots of my hair, but when I turned, there was only Owen, standing a dozen feet away and cursing under his breath as he drilled. According to the crew above, the scanners were going off more often. Jude and Aisha buzzed along the conveyor belt, boxing up rocks and shipping them off to God knows where. At the end of the 3rd week, our drills punched through to empty air. Owen and I paused, looked at each other, and cleared out more rock around the opening we'd made. This wasn't just an air pocket or the sink of a creek. There was some kind of chamber on the other side. I couldn't tell how big it was, but our headlamps barely made a dent in all that darkness. We returned to the portal to tell Jude and Aisha what we'd discovered, but they were gone, replaced by a man in a white lab coat with newscaster hair and a plastic smile. There was nothing sincere in his dry, overly firm handshake, but when I described the chamber down below, he listened with complete attention. After I'd finished, he congratulated us. Thanks to our findings, Dr. Atwood announced, it was time to move on to the next phase of the operation. There were several crates of new equipment stacked up beside the door. Among them were several ugly, futuristic-looking helmets with even more powerful headlamps, and integrated recording gear. Owen, right? Dr. Atwood squeezed the big man's shoulder, or at least as close as he could get to it. You'll go first. The cameras can only stream for 3 hours straight, so make it snappy, alright? It took a while for the big man to process the fact that he was being sent back down there. Alone. I wonder now whether Dr. Atwood planned the whole thing, knowing that no matter how afraid a man like Owen was, he would never chicken out in front of his entire work crew. especially considering how a lot of us were people who he'd frightened or bullied over the years. He took off his helmet and ran his fingers through his thinning, greasy blonde hair. Yeah, whatever, boss. We watched him go in silence. Everyone stared at the floor, thinking different versions of the same thing. That somebody should say something. That something was wrong here. That none of this was what we had signed up for. Dr. Atwood clapped his hands together. Well, now we can all take a little break. I brought coffee. And donuts! Dr. Atwood scampered off, leaving us alone with 2 thermoses of lukewarm coffee and a box of stale old fashions. There was no sign of Jude or Aisha, and nobody felt like eating much. Somehow, accepting Dr. Atwood's gift felt like making a deal with the devil. An hour passed, then 2. We ran out of things to talk about. Our eyes kept drifting back to the yawning black mouth of the portal, and to the clock. 3 hours and 30 minutes had passed when the buzzer rang for quitting time. Dr. Atwood emerged from wherever he'd been hiding to shake our hands and thank us for a job well done. Get ready for a big day tomorrow, he told us. Connie squared up with her hands on her hips and said she wanted to wait for Owen. A few of the others agreed. Dr. Atwood informed her that was against regulations. Connie had just started to tell him where he could stick his regulations when he leaned in, quick and close as a striking snake, and whispered something in her ear. When Dr. Atwood lifted his head, he was all smiles again. Connie, meanwhile, had gone pale. She grimaced while she shuffled toward the exit, and when we asked what Dr. Atwood had said to her, she only shook her head. We all arrived early the next morning, eager to hear what Owen had to say, but Dr. Atwood announced that he'd already gone below. I had a nasty suspicion that what he really meant was that Owen had never left the mine, a feeling that only intensified when he told me that I would be going down next. I could have quit right then. I had saved up enough to survive a couple months, maybe even enough to leave town, if I didn't mind sleeping in my truck and using 24-hour gyms as my only source of showers and Wi-Fi. By then, however, it wasn't about the money. I had to know what I'd been a part of these past months. The brave smile I tried to show Connie and the others probably looked more like a scowl, but no one said anything. This job was the last chance for so many of us, and not admitting to the strangeness around us seemed to be the only way we could keep it. I buckled on my helmet, picked up my gear, and walked alone into those black tunnels. I kept expecting to experience something strange during my walk down to the chamber, but I didn't see or hear anything, not even the light of Owen's headlamp. As I poked my head into the vast, empty space, I remembered uncomfortably that Dr. Atwood, and who knew how many others, were watching all this live. The walls of the chamber reached much higher than even my new, high-powered headlamps could reach. They sloped inward and up, just as the ground beneath my feet sloped down, creating an enormous, egg-shaped room. I followed Owen's footprints in the cave dust very, very carefully. The idea that I might slip and tumble into a pit whose bottom I still couldn't see made me tense enough to snap. As I trudged down the incline, I became aware of tiny indentations in the grid around me. They had probably been caused by water droplets falling from the roof of the chamber, but to my imagination, they looked like the imprints left by thousands of tiny limbs. There was a noise, too. Barely noticeable at first. It became more distinct the further I walked. At first, I thought it was just the movement of air through the chamber, but it was too steady, too rhythmic for that. I didn't want to go any further, I realized. To hell with Dr. Atwood and his precious footage. Then again, I knew that if I didn't discover the source of that sound, I would go on hearing it in my dreams until the day I died. After another 40 paces, there was still no bottom in sight. At the limit of my light, however, A lumpy shape stood out against the sameness of the pockmarked slope. Owen? The combination of fear and dust in my throat made my voice crack. There was no answer, but the noise I'd been hearing picked up its pace, almost like it was excited. I forgot all about my fear of falling and started to jog down the steep, loose ground toward whatever it was. Owen lay on his back, half covered in dust. His headlamp was off, his helmet knocked aside. There was a hideous gash in his throat, but his big belly still rose and fell slowly. The noise I'd been hearing had been the echo of his blood-choked breaths. "Balls!" Owen burbled, when I was near enough for him to recognize me. His eyes were wide with terror, but I couldn't understand what he was saying. I leaned in even closer and gestured to my ear. "The walls! They're inside of the goddamn walls!" Owen snarled and spat blood. The renewed flow drowned the rest of whatever he was trying to say. In spite of the history I had with the guy, I didn't want to see him go like this. Pants darkened by piss, eyes wide with fear, choking on his own gore. I did what I could, but I was no medic, and a few moments later, Owen's breathing had stopped completely. All the while, his final words kept booming through my brain. "The walls! They came out of the goddamn walls!" He'd saved all his strength to warn me, but how could I warn the others? According to Dr. Atwood, our equipment only allowed for one-way broadcasting back to the surface, but I no longer trusted anything he had to say. Atwood must have known something terrible had happened to Owen, but he'd sent me down here anyway, alone and unprepared, just to observe the results. It didn't matter to Arcova Industries whether I made it out of here alive or not. All they cared about was the data I was transmitting. Dr. Atwood had lied about so many things. What if he had lied about our gear as well? I fiddled with the dials and buttons on my helmet. Sure, there had to be a way to reach the others. All the while, I swept the beam of my headlamp back and forth through the darkness, sure that when I turned around, I would see some unknowable horror crawling toward me. After 10 minutes of trying, I still had nothing. I would have to try to make it back on foot, if I could, if I would even be allowed to. For all I knew, Arcova Industries had a pair of goons in biohazard suits waiting at the entrance of the tunnel for just such an occasion. The silence of the chamber made any motion painfully loud, and that was how I noticed the chittering. Just as I'd feared, just as I'd somehow known, it was coming from the depths below me, and moving faster than I could possibly run through all that loose cave dust. Visions of Owen's mangled body flashed through my brain, and then I remembered his headlamp. It had been off, not because it had burned out, but because he'd switched it off. Was the light what had drawn something out of the darkness? Was that what they had been attacking when they mutilated Owen's face and neck? Maybe extinguishing the light had been the only reason he'd survived to pass on his warning. The thought of being trapped in pitch blackness with whatever was coming was terrifying, but it was my only chance. I turned off my headlamp, lay down in the dust, and played dead. The rustling of hundreds of tiny legs came closer with every breath. Eventually, I tried not to breathe at all. The approaching sound slowed, wandered from side to side as though confused, then finally faded into the distance. I sucked in a breath of chalky cavern air. I felt around with my hands until I found what I hoped was the imprint of a boot in the dust, and began a slow, lightless crawl back to the surface. Every time I extended my hand, I expected it to brush against some horrible insectoid body. I cringed when my fingers finally brushed against hard rock. I'd found the tunnel, but what now? When I finally dared to turn on my headlamp, the light was blinding. But there were no armed guards waiting for me. No nightmarish creatures with too many limbs. Still, Arcova Industries had to have a plan for what they discovered here. Some kind of contingency in case something escaped. Didn't they? I was halfway back to the surface when a speaker crackled to life inside my helmet. I had been right after all. There was more to our equipment than met the eye. I recognized Jude's voice on the other end. Panicked, gasping, half drowned out by glass shattering in the background. Dr. Atwood! Dr. Atwood! Scanning crew! Missed one! It hatched! It hatched! The lab is... What do I do? Jude, this isn't a secure line, Atwood replied, his voice ice cold. Switch to channel 7. The conversation vanished. Now I understood what he had been scanning for, and why those crates of rocks had been taken away. Although Owen had no way of knowing it at the time, his description of the walls bleeding had been eerily accurate. There must have been eggs inside the stone. The real treasure Arcova Industries was digging for was something more valuable than coal or gold, and much, much more dangerous. I ran as hard as I could toward the portal. Every time I blinked, I saw the faces of my crew. They were friends and neighbors who I'd known for years. Some of them, like Connie, were faces I'd seen before I could walk. For all I knew, whatever had gotten loose was already attacking them. Distracted by my thoughts, I failed to pay attention to the signage on the walls, and how it had changed. Once again, I was lost, and this time there was no Owen to show me the way back. I took a deep breath and tried to think. I thought about the hallucinations I'd experienced. Was it possible that they had been meant as a sort of repellent? Was it possible that the creatures in the walls were releasing some sort of pheromone or frequency that attacked our senses? I closed my eyes, placed my hand on the rough-cut rock, and retraced my steps to the first corner I remembered turning. When I opened them again, I had found my way back. 15 minutes later, I reached the portal. The conveyor belt was stopped, the scanners abandoned, the line empty. Where the hell was everybody? I walked heel to toe as I crossed that wide warehouse floor, so silent that I could hear the buzz of industrial lighting overhead. The stillness seemed to be hiding something. I didn't like to think about what. With gritted teeth, I made my way to the exit and pushed through the door. It shrieked on its hinges. I cringed, then noticed something further along the corridor that chilled my blood. Part of the wall had swung outward, almost like a secret passage. Water pooled outward from a shattered pipe on the other side. I had found Arcova Industries' hidden laboratory, or what was left of it. The last thing I wanted to do was walk past it, but it was my only way out. Almost reluctantly, I peered inside as I tiptoed by. The lights had all been destroyed. Some broken piece of equipment whirred as it tried to activate itself, failed, and tried again. Fragments of glass crunched in the water beneath my feet. Empty containers, the same ones used to transport the stone we'd been scanning, were scattered across the floor. Among them lay a slim young man in a familiar blue vest. A few gristly strands of red were all that was left of his head and neck. That chittering noise filled the area as soon as I approached, but I didn't wait around to see its cause. I sprinted down the corridor with one thing on my mind. Whatever these things were, they hated the light. If I could find the circuit breaker and plunge the building into darkness, anybody left inside might have a chance of getting out alive. I slammed into the push bar of the next door, only to discover it was locked. Of course it was. Dr. Atwood was probably in damage control mode, trying to contain whatever had gotten loose while he figured out his next steps. The narrow glass window was shatterproof, but I bashed my fist against it like a madman anyway. Worried faces appeared in the entrance of the training room to my right. Connie, Dr. Atwood, a few others. Atwood forced a smile and approached, his hands in the pockets of his white lab coat. While the sound of scuttling limbs behind me came closer and closer, he casually unlocked the door and reached out to pull me through. I felt my vision blur. One version of me was still standing there, frozen in time. Another followed Dr. Atwood into the next hallway. He relocked the door, switched out the lights in the corridor behind me, then guided me, or the shade of me, into the mundane training room where my friends and neighbors were waiting. I watched myself, telling everyone what I'd found, gesturing wildly to the door while Dr. Atwood slipped away. He unlocked another passage in the wall, slipped on a gas mask, and began pressing buttons. A fine white mist began to hiss out of the wall vents. Suddenly all of us were choking, clutching our throats, falling onto the cheap carpet while the world went black. My vision somehow spiraled out even further, until I saw the explosives that were already rigged to collapse the portal and bury the whole area beneath ashes and rubble. For all I knew, they had been there since Arcova Industries started digging. Maybe they knew exactly what was down there, and that was why they had sent a skeleton crew of 3 to direct the rest of us. Expendables who could be discarded once they had what they'd come for. The mine's prior owners could be blamed for the cave-in, and the destruction would bury any evidence of what they'd done. After all, who would investigate any further? It would just be one more tragedy for a little town that had already seen too many. I wondered how I was being made aware of all this. Was the same pheromone that had affected our minds in the tunnels being directed at me now, to show me what was coming? It occurred to me that, like any living thing, whatever was in the hallway behind me simply did not want to die. It had killed Owen and Jude, but now I was its last, best hope of survival. My mind snapped back to the present. Dr. Atwood placed a reassuring hand on my shoulder. He was trying to urge me through the door and proceed with the rest of his plan. My high school football days were far behind me, but I could still throw a mean shoulder check when I needed to. The blow took Atwood by surprise. It sent him careening back across the floor, leaving the door behind me wide open. My friends and neighbors looked up at me with shock in their eyes, and I realized that I had no idea what to say to them. Atwood groaned and climbed to his feet. It was now or never. "I can't explain. We gotta get out of here. All of us. Right now." People glanced at each other, uncertain. Then Connie lurched to her feet and started toward me. "Well, come on," she told the rest of them. "We should have known it was too good to be true." "Stop," Atwood bellowed. All traces of that phony smile had disappeared, replaced by a look of wild obsession. He pulled a pistol from his pocket. "Get back in that room!" He waved the weapon wildly, the door behind him forgotten. I can't describe the thing I saw rising up over his back, but it was more than enough to convince my workmates that everything I'd said was true. As its limbs closed around Dr. Atwood, I sprinted to the end of the second corridor and switched off the circuit breaker. The facility plunged into the blood-red gloom of emergency lighting, but none of us needed to see to know the way out. We'd all had parents and grandparents who'd worked in these mines, who we'd brought lunchboxes to or ran up to hug after a shift, careless of the grime that covered them. Screams, darkness, slamming doors. I kept running, praying that everyone would follow. We had just cleared the final corridor when the detonation started. Distant at first, like thunder, they grew louder as they approached. The ground shook. Atwood must have had a dead man's trigger. Nobody was foolish enough to go for the vehicles. We aimed for the woods instead, where the brittle pine trees might help to deaden the impact of blast-flung rocks and the landslides that were soon coming. No one called the police. No one needed to. We heard the sirens even before the rumbling stopped. More help came from the next town over, but there was little to be done. Nothing was coming alive out of that mine. Nothing human, anyway. Our descriptions of what had happened left the investigators scratching their heads. Some, like Connie, provided a tale full of mad scientists and cave monsters. Others stated that everyone had been called into the meeting room. I ran by with my warning, and then the mine collapsed. At the time, I went with the second version. I wasn't sure who I could trust, or what the consequences of telling the truth might be. But more than that, I was tired. Arcova Industries had already taken so much from me. My time, my energy, my hopes for the future, and very nearly my life. When I packed my truck and left for Arizona, the inquiry was still ongoing. At the end of the month, I received my final paycheck from Arcova Industries, along with an official letter informing me of the company's permanent closure. It was eerily similar to the memo that Ma had received, except that, instead of an end, it felt like a beginning. But where had the other crates we'd scanned gone? Did the things beneath the mountain survive the blast? I never learned the truth behind any of it. It's been years since I've breathed anything other than clean, desert air. But my dreams still follow those winding tunnels underground. Sometimes I wake up in a cold sweat, wondering whether I ever actually left. After all, the hallucinations those things pumped into my mind were so vivid, so real. How can I be sure they ever really ended? Hey everybody, hope you enjoyed today's story. This one was written by John Beardify. He's one of my favorite authors that we feature on the channel here, so I hope you all will give him some love in the comments. In the description, as always, I'll be listing the author as well as some of their work. John Beardify has a book out, which you can check out on Amazon. So I hope you all will follow him on Reddit, on Amazon, and support his work. I really enjoy these types of stories like this one. It's kind of a small town vibe where in the end everybody gets together and kind of uses their knowledge of the town, or in this case the knowledge of the coal mine system to kind of foil the bad guy. And these stories with a giant mega corporation who's kind of very secretive and working in the shadows. So I really enjoyed this one. I thought it was a really interesting, kind of different story. One that I definitely hadn't read anything like this before. We get a lot of the same types of stories sometimes, so this definitely something a little bit different here today. Now, I did do a video on the channel yesterday talking about the remonetization stuff. I did forget to mention, which I wanted to quickly touch on, the fact that I did have to not delete but private some videos on the channel. So I apologize if anybody's going to look for a particular video and they're not finding it. I did try to limit it to compilations mainly. So you'll notice that there's not very many compilations left on the channel. Particularly like the 8 scary police stories and 8 scary park ranger stories. I privated those videos. Chances are I probably won't unprivate them because we got remonetized the day after I did that. So I do think it had a lot to do with the tweet and all of us horror narrators kind of banding together. But I also don't want to go back on something I did the day before I got remonetized. So I'll probably be leaving those compilations as private. I do have a bunch of playlists on the channel. I would encourage people who like the long videos, go check out the playlists. I have pretty much every author who features on the channel regularly. I have a playlist for each author, as well as playlists for like law enforcement, park ranger, Hollow's End. There's a playlist of just my stories. So I would encourage you guys, if you do miss the compilations, go check out those playlists on the channel homepage. Other than that, I didn't really private much else. There's a few stories that kind of I noticed were on a bunch of different channels, so I did private those. But yeah, I just wanted to quickly mention that so that if anybody's looking for a particular story, or a particular compilation, they realize what happened. For anybody who missed the video yesterday, we are remonetized. So that's amazing news. It's really hugely thanks to you guys. And still waiting for a few other horror narrators to get remonetized, but things are really moving in the right direction now, which is amazing. The Hollow's End book is available for pre-order. Right now it's just the ebook edition, but I will have more details about the paperback and the hardcover within the next week or so. Those should be available for pre-order. Yeah, so that's pretty much it for right now. If you guys enjoyed this story, please leave a comment. As always, like, subscribe, comment, hype the video if you can. That really does help out a lot. And should have more stories for you this Thursday. Should have another one for you. And new Hollow's End story first draft is done, so just need to do a kind of a round of edits on it, and I'm hoping to have that one out for you guys next Monday, is the plan right now. Alright, hope you have a good rest of your day, and I'll talk to you guys later.